So
Great.
just a brief introduction. Uh, Professor Van Aken, he's a revolutionary contemporary artist whose work transcends ordinary mediums and fuses science with art to express themes related to communication, climate change, and the ever-increasing impact of technology. He's world-renowned for designing the trees of 40 fruits, which are these amazingly beautiful hybrid fruit trees. And each of them produce about 40 previously lost variations of fruit historically grown in New York over the past 400 years. And he does this to preserve its rich biodiversity. He is also a professor at Syracuse University at the School of Art. And his work has been featured in National Geographic and Smithsonian videos and documentaries, which have amassed over 12 million views on YouTube. And he's also earned many accolades, including the prestigious Joan Mitchell Award, which selects only 25 artists nationally in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Van Aken.
Thank you. And I'm like, if you need it, I'm going to hire you to introduce our visiting artist lecture series. That was fantastic. Thank you
so much. We'd also,
go ahead.
We'd also like to thank our amazing club advisor, Mrs. Martin. She's guided us throughout this entire process and made all of this possible.
That's fantastic. That's great. Okay, so I guess I'll just get started. All right. Okay, so for about 10 years now, I've been working on a project entitled The Tree of 40 Fruit, which is a single tree that produces 40 different varieties of stone fruit, including peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, and almonds, all that grow on one tree. And sort of before this project, I was working with the idea of hoaxes. So I started my, I started to create my own radio hoaxes, but there isn't really much longevity for that. I mean, you do it once and the sort of hoax is up. But I started to become interested in the etymology of the word, and I found out that hoax comes from hocus pocus, which in turn comes from a line in the Catholic Eucharist where a priest says, hoc est enim corpus meum, over bread, and turns it into the body of Christ. And I did research on this and found out that it's actually called transubstantiation. And it's when the appearance of a thing remains the same and its reality changes. And I think for an artist, that was really interesting because, you're always dealing with appearances or shaping and changing appearances, but you rarely shift the reality of the thing. It's something that's more created than shifted. And so I thought, what could I make that's like, that piece of bread? And so I came up with this idea for the tree. So the idea is that it looks like a normal looking tree throughout the majority of the year until spring, when it blossoms in all of these different tones of pink and white. And then throughout the summer and into early fall, it grows all of these fruit. The trees are essentially built through the process of grafting. And what I'll do is I'll go out in January and I'll collect branches from trees that I want to preserve. And it's a very simple process of cutting and inserting it to the ends of other branches. They take within a year, within 2 to 3 years, they produce fruit. And I had known about grafting for pretty much my whole life, as long as I can remember. My great-grandfather actually made a living doing it. And he worked in these orchards outside of Philadelphia and grafted a bunch of peach trees. And I think the thing that was most impressive to me is that, I grew up on a farm, so I was surrounded by the people that were very accomplished, right? Farmers, they have to fix all of their own tools and equipment, but yet they were always amazed by my great-grandfather, and anytime they would invoke his name, they would talk about him with this great reverence because he knew how to do this. And I as I became an artist, then I started to realize the metaphorical implications, right? In a world where everything is becoming more and more hybrid, complex, grafting seemed to serve as a metaphor for that. So one of the problems when I began the project is that I couldn't find 40 different varieties of stone fruit to graft onto the tree. And this is despite the fact that I lived in New York State, which 100 years ago was the second leading producer of stone fruit, next to California, of course, in the country. And I started to, as I would go out and look for these varieties, I realized the extent to which we've industrialized agriculture. So the majority of stone fruit growing takes place in California, whereas New York focuses more on apple varieties. But with the varieties that I could find, I would bring them back to my nursery here, and I would, graft them, and I would start to create these multi-grafted trees just to preserve the varieties. And I thought one of the things that was really interesting is that I could collapse space, right? I could take an entire orchard and collapse it onto a single tree. So this is what the tree of 40 fruit look like when they're planted. So they're at this stage, they're anywhere between 3 to 5 years and might have, only 6 to 10 grafts on them. And this is what they look like about 7 years later. And this is after they have all 40 varieties. As I started to develop the project, well, it actually turned out by mistake. I figured out that I could design how the tree blossoms. And because each of the varieties has a sort of different blossoming time, it's slightly different. They have a slightly different color and form. Depending on how and where I grafted them, I could shape how it blossoms and appears in spring. So here's a detail of the blossom. And so the trees, they tend to blossom over sort of a 3-week period. Typically a fruit tree will blossom over about a 10-day period. But yeah, this kind of extends it by grafting all these varieties together. And each of the trees has a diagram. So what I do is I track the varieties and where they're grafted. And this is more, the color coding is really just to determine, or just to keep a memory of what year they're grafted onto the tree. And here's what they look like in fruit. The fruit, they'll start fruiting in sort of early July. And here, I'm in upstate New York, so it gets cold the beginning of October, and they kind of end fruiting at that point, but you still get a 3 to 4 month period of fruiting. Of course, this tree is on the Syracuse University campus, so it's rare to find any fruit on it. The students, they know when the tree blossoms, they know the varieties, so they're very quick to pick them, and sometimes pick them when they're way too green. So as the project expanded, I would start getting invited to other locations to create these trees, I realized that what I could do is, if I researched the varieties, I could try to, source all the varieties locally, graft them onto the tree, and then it becomes an agricultural history or a memory of a place. So sort of that relationship of index to archive. And, it really became a conservation project at that point. And so I have trees all the way from Maine to California at this point. And originally it started, the people that supported the project were primarily art collectors. So these were all sold through my art gallery. And I kind of realized that was a lot of effort for 1 or 2 people to have. I mean, I was so incredibly appreciative of the people that supported the project because they really made it happen. But I started to focus on public settings. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll work with someone who wants to sponsor a tree. We'll find a public location for it so that everyone can sort of see it and look at it. And this is the most recent planting we did at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, New York. And we, this was just in, sort of the end of October. We followed this really weird, sort of, they call it, there's a lot of people that question this, but Rudolf Steiner had all these ideas about planting trees and this sort of mystical approach, which I'm like, how do you know it if you don't try? So we buried crystals in cow horns and placed them next to the tree. Then in the spring, you dig them back up and make tea. So that's like taking this compost that was in the horn and you use it to nourish the tree for the next year. And it's interesting because I think a lot of my work recently has started to go back to past ways of agriculture and just testing things and trying it out. And we really don't have much evidence for agricultural practices that were taking place before we industrialized agriculture, after the Second World War. So going back and testing a lot of these different approaches, I can find ways that are organic and, hopefully can still be employed and, to take care of the trees. So every couple of years, the project goes, it gets picked up on the internet. I had no idea that 12 million people watch those videos. I don't watch any video that I've ever done because if I do, I get really, I don't know. Yeah, it makes me not want to do videos. But when the project originally got picked up, I had already moved away from the tree of 40 fruit, and I had started working on other projects. And it was sort of like I got, asked by Department of Defense to come talk to them. So I went to Washington and, spoke to DARPA about food security, which they've identified as a national security threat. Talked to the Department of Agriculture. And then most recently, when the project went viral this time, it was on Kanye West's Twitter feed. He just posted this image. And I don't think I need to even teach another class. Like, I was petrified. My students started emailing and texting me, and I'm like, oh man, this is awful. This could be terrible. And they thought it was the best thing in the world. So yeah, I've like moved into like some weird cool teacher status with them. To give you an idea, the diversity of the fruit, like I even for someone like me, I grew up on a farm and thought I understood fruit. I thought I understood plums and peaches, and until I got into this project, I really had no idea of the type of diversity that was within fruit. And so these are plums that are taken from just one tree of 40 fruit in 1 week in August. And so there's, the varieties come from everywhere. In here, there's varieties that date back 2,000 years to Syria. There's varieties of unknown origin that have been grown throughout the European continent for a few thousand years. There's Asian plum varieties, which most likely originated in China and made their way through Japan, and seeds were carried here to the U.S. So it's really, I'm very interested in this idea of them, coming from all of these different locations, and and just trying to preserve not just the fruit variety itself, but preserving the culture that's sort of behind it. I've come to think of fruit as just as much as their food or an agricultural product. They're a cultural product. I mean, these things are really akin to our way of coming to the United States, and for all of us, and they come from all over the world. So after talking to the Department of Defense and realizing just how threatened some of these fruit varieties were, I set out to do everything I could to possibly preserve them. And really the only way that I knew to do it was through art. So I would go to orchards as they were being cut out, and I would collect the trunk section, or they call it the bowl. which included the grafting nut. And you can see where these varieties transition, where the bark transitions, and that's where the original graft took place. I started creating my own herbarium specimens. So I would collect branches, blossoms from trees to create my own pressings, which a lot of times are used for doing botanical drawings, but then they are still very much a DNA. You're preserving that DNA of the variety. And so that's sort of evolved into this, and this is all part of a show. I have close to 250 that I've done for an exhibition at Michigan State University, and it's called Seeds of Resistance. That evolved into creating herbarium specimens that were popular in the 19th century. People would make these cyanotypes of the plants as a way to preserve them, because the plant material is really ephemeral. That led to creating my own printing press in the basement of my house. So now I have a copper plate etching press and a letter press where I'm creating a series of my own botanical prints that describe the varieties in detail. A lot of these varieties, you only come about them in sort of fragments. And so creating these description compiles all of that information. And there's the stories are just, they're absolutely interesting. And then it also, extending from these sort of more scientific ways of preserving the fruit, as I encounter these sort of rituals that are based around the fruit, I'll actually start to reenact them. So this, I read about in China. This is a very old ritual, but what they would do is collect peach branches during a solar eclipse. You soak them in salt water until the next new moon. You hang them by a red string, and they're essentially a magic wand, right? The growth on a peach tree from this current year is also called a wand. And so I like this idea of creating magic wands. And, so in 2017, I went out and collected peach branches, soaked them to the next new moon. And it's still, one of the things that's still very much practiced in China is the idea of peach panels, where you hang sort of peach colored wood or peach wood itself on either side of the door during the new year. And it's to bring good luck. So all of this, I'm like doing all of these projects. I'm creating cyanotypes, herbarium specimens, doing all these things. And I'm like, I'm not making it very far in terms of preserving the varieties or getting them out to a larger audience. So I came up with this idea about 4 or 5 years ago of creating a public orchard. And incredibly naive in my approach, I set out to find an acre of land in New York City, or as close as I could to it. And I didn't have much luck for a really long time until I was approached by Governor's Island. And Governor's Island is it's a former Navy base. It's in, it's 5-minute boat ride from the southern tip of Manhattan. And it was given to the city in, I think, 2000. And all of a sudden it opened up 178 acres of land in Manhattan that part of the agreement was that it couldn't be developed commercially. So it's become a really interesting space where they're doing all sorts of projects that are based on the climate and the environment. And it serves as, very much as a park and a cultural institution. So they said, we have an acre of land for you. So I put together a proposal and came up with the idea of an open orchard. So the open orchard is anywhere between 50 to 150 trees. There'll be multi-grafted trees with 3 or 4 varieties grafted onto each tree. And I'm looking at it, it's very much aesthetic. It's very much art, because I don't think there's anything more beautiful than seeing fruit trees blossom in spring. But the place is also sort of this experiential setting, but then it's also a place of learning, and a place where now what we're doing is projects, conserving varieties from New York City. So all of the varieties that will be grafted to the trees on Governor's Island are varieties that originated or were historically grown in New York City. And it turns out that New York City could be argued as like the fruit city of the United States, because it's the place where all of these fruit varieties pass through. So, before Europeans arrived, the Lenni Lenape were cultivating Prunus maritima, or beach plums, on the banks of the Hudson and in the bay. And then when the Dutch came, they brought cherries with them, and the Lenni Lenape were quick to cultivate them up and down the Hudson River Valley. And then even the first governor that came, the first Dutch governor who came to New York in the early 1600s, brought a Belgian Belgian pear with him, planted it on what's today 13th Street and 3rd Avenue. And the tree lasted 250 years. It was pretty much one of the only trees that was left as the city kept growing and becoming a larger and larger city. There's also varieties like the Newton Pippin, which was the first sort of international apple, as the US was still a colony. They developed this apple, and the kings and queens of Europe would pay exorbitant amounts of money to have this particular apple shipped to them. And there's other interesting stories with these fruit. There's a lightning tree that was struck in the Bowery, and from its roots sprang a twig that eventually became this world-renowned Washington plum. And then there's also the story of this George IV peach, which somebody was walking down the street eating this old mixin peach, which no longer exists, takes the peach pit, throws it between two buildings. The tree grows, somebody tastes the fruit, realizes how good it is, and then it becomes grown around the world for 100 years before almost disappearing. And then we're taking all these varieties and bringing them back and grafting them onto the trees at Governor's Island. So, to go back to that idea of a place of learning, we've started working with New York City Parks, where we've done a series of workshops the past year on everything from how to prune trees to plant them, how to care for them during the year. And so we invite school groups out, we invite companies that are looking for retreats, and it's odd that I think my art practice has become more about having workshops than necessarily a tangible object. Other things we're doing are fresh eating tours, and then through a lot of the research I've done on the varieties, I found these recipes that are like 4 or 5 centuries old, and I'm working with chefs now to attempt to recreate them. So this is a dish called Plum Clafou Tea, and it's been grown in France for longer than anybody can remember. Essentially, you take prune plums, coat them in sugar, put them into the bottom of a frying pan, and you cover them with a batter that's very similar to pancakes in a way. And so that's what it looks like. And then when it's finished, you have to eat it within that hour. When it's like, it's kind of unbelievable in how good it is. And then I've also, one of my graduate students is from India, and her mother sent me her plum chutney recipe, which I followed to her exact directions. And I have never tasted plum chutney like that. It is extraordinary. So in an odd way, it's sort of going back to the past to discover all of these new things. Currently, I'm working on a book with it's going to be coming out through Timber Press. It's all about the orchard on Governor's Island, and so that's sort of what I do. One of the things that I've been telling people, and I think it's sort of become a way to think about it, is that, in the early part of the U.S., they had farmers divided into two categories. One they would call commercial or professional, and the others they would call amateur. And I like the idea of being an amateur because the amateur orchardists were the ones that preserved all of these varieties. They did it because, and this is the root of amateur, they did it because they loved it. And through that, they preserved the majority of biodiversity that we still have today. So that's it. Sorry, I talked 5 more minutes than I was supposed to.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. It's fascinating, the deep and rich history behind all of these different variations of fruit.
Yeah, and it's odd. Like, there's all of these stories where, somebody from Shanghai sends somebody in South Carolina 2 seeds. The person plants them, and those trees become the genetic parents of 50% of the peaches grown in the U.S. today.
Wow.
Right?
That's crazy.
Yeah, and it's been, first it was all about the fruit for me, but I think now how it's evolved is that it's become about the history and sort of the culture that gets embedded in them.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool shift. I mean, it's really fascinating to know the stories behind how a lot of the things that we take for granted today came to be.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not good if you look at the modern example. But
so now we'll be moving on to the Q&A segment of our speaker event, where all of you guys have the opportunity to ask questions to Professor Van Aken. So just a brief overview of how it'll work. So you guys can either put your questions in the everyone chat, where everyone can see it. And if someone would like to upvote that question, they could just add like a caret sign underneath that in the chat. Or if you'd like to remain a little anonymous, you can either PM Ray or Sanjay by saying anonymous : and then your question. We have a couple of questions that our team has come up with as well, so we'll go over 2 or 3 of that first, and then once we get some questions rolling in, we'll also ask you those.
Sure.
So our first question for you is, how did you come to become the world-renowned contemporary artist you are today? Like, what's your story?
Oh God, I don't know. I don't know if I fully embrace that title. Sort of the story was I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, and I at the time I thought it was like the worst upbringing ever. In retrospect, I'm so grateful that it was that way. My parents bounced around when I was in high school, went to a couple different high schools, but to be honest, the thing is, once I left the farm, I felt like I've never worked, because you work so hard then. It's like I feel like I've been retired since I was 16, which is great, right? It's like but I always I was like, okay, I need to see some of the world, and so I knew I didn't want to go into farming, at least right away. But the one thing I loved to do was draw. I didn't think that was a possibility, but I took a class in college and thought, well, if I'm going to do something my whole life, it might as well be drawing. And yeah, that sort of, I guess in one way or the other, it all led to where I am today.
Wow. So was it that like one college class that sparked you to pursue art as a career?
I think it was a good teacher, right? There was, I don't know if it was so much drawing. It was, I had this one teacher, it was actually a printmaking class. I met him in the drawing class, but he encouraged me to take a printmaking class with him. And he was just a great teacher that made me love it even more. And yeah, and kind of helped me envision how this would look to be an artist. And he made it look really good. Come in, teach a couple classes once a week, paint the rest of the year. That sounds fantastic, right?
Has that in any way inspired you to become a professor yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah, because you really, I mean, as much as we think of art as being this solo sort of practice, it's you're really reliant on the people around you, right? And people that'll push you, and also help you. And yeah, since I started teaching, I had this other teacher that pulled this like horrible trick on me where it was, I think he said, do you want to go to Pittsburgh and help me with the after school program? And I was like, sure, I'll go with you. And next thing I know, he drops me off in a class full of students with a handful of like number 2 pencils and some blank pages. And he goes, well, teach these people how to draw. I'll be back in 3 hours. And it was terrifying, but at least I had to think on my feet. But no, I truly enjoy it too. I mean, it's great to be able to, to help people like you guys.
Thanks. A couple of people are wondering whether they can practice grafting on their own at home, and what are some good plants that they can try to graft?
Okay. Plants that your parents don't really like a lot. That would be the first place I'd start, or permission from the parents. That would probably be first place to start. So you can graft just about anything as long as you are within the same family. Okay. So, genus Prunus is really unique in terms of you can graft multiple varieties within it all together, right? It's because they don't have a lot of diversity. Other groups of other families or other genus, it becomes more difficult, but you can still do it. But typically you have to work within the same family of trees, which is actually a lot easier now because they have like plant ID apps for your phone. So you can go out, you can, get the plant ID'd right away, know what it is, and you can go out and find, other matching trees that you can graft to. It takes a little bit of work to figure it out, and the hardest part isn't actually the mechanical sort of cutting and inserting. It's really more getting the timing right. You want to make sure you're grafting the trees while they're still dormant and right before they start to break dormancy. And a tree's breaking dormancy when the buds on the trees start to swell, right? So winter, which is not really winter for you guys, it's it's like a half winter, right? When the leaves start to come back, right? Or when the tree just starts to have new growth, that's the best time to graft. But you can also do it with everything. I think I read something the other day where it's like 50% of the tomatoes that we eat are all now grafted, right? Because what they'll do is they'll graft the tomato variety that they want onto a root structure that picks up a lot of nutrients, so that the plants will grow, so many more tomatoes.
A couple of people are asking where they can learn the steps of grafting themselves.
Okay, so you guys have this amazing thing out there. It's called the California Rare Fruit Growers Group, okay? And every county out there has a chapter. And, they do workshops on grafting. So that's one place, but at least the place where I learned is that I just stopped in and I would talk to people who have orchards, right? I would, I'd be driving by and I'd just stop and I would tell them, I'm like, hey, do you know anything about grafting? And it's amazing. These are people, you have to think that somebody who's a farmer or a grower spends an inordinate amount of time alone, right? So just the fact that you're somebody to talk to, and the fact that you're young, that's, and I think a lot of it for me was I had met a lot of people that were in their late 60s or older, and they had spent a lifetime learning all these skills and they didn't have anybody to pass it on to. There's plenty of online stuff. I mean, it's easy. There's tons of videos online, but actually going and talking to a grower is a great thing. And you guys are close enough where you can do this. You should go to Andy's Orchards. So that's down, it's not quite Gilroy. It's right before Gilroy. Andy grows a lot of heirloom varieties, and I have never tasted fruit like he grows there. It is just, and then he also has this thing where, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, it's where I got this idea of doing fresh eating tours. Like he'll do tours during the summer, and they're like mini rock shows. There's like 500 or 600 people show up to taste a particular type of plum. It's, y'all in California, yeah, you don't have any snow to shovel, so you got to find like great things to do, like fresh eating tours.
We also got an anonymous question asking, what advice do you have for students who'd like to pursue a similar career path as you?
Oh, wow. I think one of the things that I didn't even anticipate doing this, but it just sort of happened. And I think it became really pivotal was I got this fellowship to go to Poland 2 years after communism fell, right? And the country, it was like the economy was completely destabilized. They had just thrown out all of the accepted artists, and they hired all of these people that were dissident artists, and it completely changed the way that I looked at art. So I'd say for like whatever your field is, go to that place that challenges you the most, right? And I think a lot of it is getting out of your comfort zone. And also, I think it was completely reckless and illogical to go into art. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, no matter how you look at it, right? It's not like there's a huge payday waiting for you. I've been incredibly lucky to be where I'm at. But in retrospect, if I was looking at my like 20-year-old self, I'd be like, you're insane, right? It was, I think I got lucky in a lot of ways, but I think the good thing is I think living a creative and intellectual life is worth whatever you have to do that. And that's, yeah, whatever sacrifices you have to make along the way, worth it.
Yeah, I definitely see what you mean. Like, it seems really illogical, but but it must make a really satisfying life where you get to go out and do what you enjoy.
Yeah, and it's you always having really great experiences, meeting new people and thinking of new things. Like a lot of my friends, they have career, like I've tried to avoid having a job or a career. That was like two of my big goals, and I've like been successful. I haven't had to wear a suit other than to like a wedding or a funeral for about 20 years. So I feel like I've like really reached some kind of like, I've done something right. But I see a lot of my friends who have careers and they that's what they're, you know, it seems crazy to think that in your early 20s, you're making decisions that are going to dictate and determine what you're going to do the rest of the 60 years of your life. That's probably even crazier than deciding to be an artist. Yeah. So, yeah. I don't know if that was a good sales pitch for being an artist, but I totally believe in doing it.
Yeah, I mean, like, it sounds great. I mean, maybe it's more logical just simply because, like, the reward is massive if you do happen to become one.
Yeah. And I think another thing too is that this, you know, if you do anything long enough, people think there's something to it. So if you do crazy things long enough, people are going to be like, yeah, there's got to be something to that. Otherwise, why would he be doing it for that long?
Our teacher advisor is asking what you teach in your courses, and she's wondering whether you teach grafting and or other types of art.
Oh, it's funny. I won't ever teach my students grafting, right? Because I think that it's, you know, I'm like, hey, I took the time to learn how to do this. You need to find your own thing, right? And this idea of like, I don't want you to be able to make my work. I want you to develop your own work, you know, and yeah, because I'm very much against this idea of like, you know, where people get out of school and make work just like you. But I would, in terms of teaching, my favorite classes are teaching first-year undergraduate students and first-year graduate students. And typically, anymore, I mostly teach graduate students, but the thing I like about those two groups is that there's not a lot of pretense, right? The first-year undergrad and first-year grad students, they come to school and they're like, I don't know anything, and I'm here to learn, and I'll try anything. And I think there's a lot to be said, because as soon as you start thinking that you know exactly what you're doing, that's when that's when things get boring.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, I think it is like, yeah, I don't exactly know how to explain it, but I do really agree with you from the standpoint of like, you should go out and try to do your own thing. You should, you know, try to sample everything and like sort of favor it. I think that's a really, you know, interesting and, you know, very rewarding philosophy of life that isn't really carried on a lot today.
Well, I think the other thing, you know, and it has a lot to do with, you know, and I'm at fault with this as much as anyone else, is a lot of it is with education, right? And it's like a fine line to walk, where it's like, here's knowledge that people absolutely need, right? But we live in a culture that celebrates innovation, right? So the question is like, how do you give people the information that gives them a broad enough view of the field or the context that they're in, but then how do you teach the skill set to move beyond that, right? And that's a lot, you know. That's, if I get close to that before I'm done teaching, I'll be incredibly happy with myself. But you know, that's the challenge.
All right, we have one final anonymous question, and then
All right.
I think it is getting a little late, so we may start wrapping up soon. Someone was wondering, what's the limit of grafting? For example, could we like graft an apple tree onto a maple tree? Is it possible to create even a 50 or 60 fruit tree?
Okay. So I'm going to put this in the chat. Hopefully they have new stuff on their website. There's a company, it's a Japanese biotech company that I've been working with. But we've been developing a way to graft different plant materials together. So this is going to, I don't care, I'll tell you. So the way I build the tree of 40 fruit is this, they call it, I use inner stock, right? So you can't readily graft a cherry onto a plum tree because it's slightly different, and all grafting is dependent on cellular structure. But if I use what they call as interstock, a variety that's compatible with both the plum and the cherry tree, I can graft all of those together. So it's cherry, interstock, plum. So we're working on different types of plants that can act as interstock varieties so that we can do things like graft vegetables onto trees. And what that'll do is that'll make it easy for us to grow certain types of foods in different environments. So, you know, if you take desert trees that have deep tap roots that go into aquifers, there's a potential for us to be able to grow vegetables on top of those trees.
Wow.
Right? And you're growing food in the desert. So, yeah, that's what we're working on.
That's totally mind-blowing.
Yeah. So, yeah, we'll see. Yeah, it's all haven't gotten there yet, but we're working on it.
Man, let's just imagine vegetables growing on trees. Like, wow. Thank you so much for coming, Professor Van Aken. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you. And Rebecca wins in background by far. Like, yeah. That's Yayo Kasama, right?
Yeah, it's one of the mirror rooms.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And if you guys, enjoyed this presentation, I've put a link to our Facebook group in the chat. I guess I can send it one more time. If you're interested in, listening to more guest speakers like Professor Van Aken, we highly recommend you check that out. And also, we have a bit of a feedback survey, which we'll be sending out in the chat as well to get your guys' thoughts on what did you guys like about this event and what we can do better. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, this is great. And so you guys are just doing this as a club, right?
Yeah.
This is fantastic. This is really cool. Okay, I like this even more now.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah,
we've actually just recently started, so that's really encouraging of you.
Yeah, no, this is great. This is fantastic that you're getting together to do this.
And these are sophomores in high school.
Are you kidding me?
I am not kidding you.
Oh my God, you're also evolved.
So they're reaching for the stars, these guys, and it's fun.
It's great. Well, it's even better knowing this. You guys are pros. You're a lot better than a lot of college audiences I've spoken to.
Wow, thank you so much.
Yeah. Great. Well, have a good night.
You too.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
We'll see you.
See you later.